I finished the series last night. Critically acclaimed, beautifully shot. The finale was intense. The protagonist was dead. The system was still corrupt. And the last scene was just rain falling on a gray city. It was masterful, but it left me feeling cold. I turned it off and just sat in the dark for a minute. And I had this sudden, weird memory of an old German film I saw once. It was black and white, probably from the 1950s. The plot was ridiculous, something about a mischievous student playing pranks or singing Postman in the Mountains. What was strange was when it was made. It was filmed in a country that was, at the time, still basically a field of rubble. People were literally rebuilding their homes from scraps, not knowing where their next meal was coming from. And that is what they went to the cinema to see. People laughing, falling in love, singing songs. It seems completely backward, doesn't it? We who live in relative comfort are obsessed with watching the world end. They who had lost everything just wanted to watch someone be happy. That memory, it really stuck with me. And it points to this core paradox, how we consume stories. Why did people who were literally picking through ruins, recovering from this massive collective catastrophe, why did they crave narratives of an intact world? Stories focused on simple restoration.
While we, today, living with so much relative stability, maybe even comfort, seem completely drawn to stories of collapse, dystopia, the end of the world, or just endless bad news.
Exactly. It's this contradiction. The historical search for psychological recovery versus, well, our modern obsession with what feels like psychological dread.
It's fascinating. Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. We're going to explore how these narratives work as psychological tools, really, how they reflect deep societal anxieties.
And how our whole relationship with negative media has shifted, hasn't it?
Yeah.
From those post-war comfort films all the way to today's dystopia and that constant doom scrolling.
Yeah.
It's always this swing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Between wanting stability and needing somehow to grapple with complexity. That's what drives storytelling. So our mission today really is to connect that historical quest for stability. You see it perfectly in the German idea of Heimat. Connect that with the modern challenge, which is, information overload, fragmented, really complicated trauma. We need to analyze what these totally contrasting narrative approaches tell us about how societies recover psychologically.
And importantly, land on some practical strategies. How does critical thinking, how does mindful consumption actually help us navigate this world that's just saturated with negativity without, just sticking our heads in the sand?
Exactly, without sacrificing awareness. That's the key.
Okay, let's dive right in. Post-World War II, Germany and Austria. I mean, you have to try and picture the scale of the trauma. It wasn't just the physical destruction, cities flattened.
Unbelievable destruction.
But also the displacement. Millions of people, refugees, expellees. They didn't just lose their homes, they lost their whole sense of place. Their history, their national identity gone. Completely collapsed with the end of the Nazi regime.
Precisely. And in that context, this profound material scarcity, this psychological exhaustion, both Germany and Austria had immense difficulty finding a new identity, a stable role in this new post-war world. It was an identity vacuum.
And the trauma was just too big, too raw to deal with directly yet.
Way too big. The society couldn't possibly process it head on at that point. So in that moment of dislocation, the Heimatfilm, the homeland film, it wasn't just entertainment, not just escapism. It was a deeply functional psychological tool used on a huge cultural scale.
Okay.
It offered immediate accessible relief. And crucially, for recovery, it helped shore up this idea of group identity and unity when society was just dangerously fragmented.
So they were like cultural stabilizers. But what was this idealized home, this Heimat? I hadn't heard that phrase, Wunschbild, Landschaftsbild, Stadt, before. The wish image country versus the horror image city. That framing is so stark.
It really drove the whole genre, ideologically and aesthetically.
Yeah.
The term Heimat, historically, it's always been more than just homeland. It's deeply tied to belonging, identity, even moral integrity.
Okay.
So the films from the 50s, often right around the start of the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, they presented this meticulously built Heilwelt, which translates roughly as an intact, a whole, or undamaged world.
And visually, lots of mountains, lakes.
Exactly. Sweeping shots of mountains, off in the Alps. Pristine lakes, cozy little villages. That was the visual signature.
And wasn't Technicolor a big part of that? My memory of that one film was black and white, but the genre is known for that super saturated, almost painfully bright color, right?
Yeah, absolutely deliberate. That visual language screamed purity, abundance, a total contrast to the gray rubble people were living in outside the cinema. And the films hammered home that dichotomy. Wunschbild, Landschaftsbild, Stadt.
The country as the wish image.
The rural landscape, yeah.
Yeah.
Often Bavaria or the Austrian Alps. It was positioned as the ultimate psychological cure for the chaos and destruction associated with the city.
But why was the city specifically the horror image, not just chaotic?
Because the city stood for everything the collective psyche was trying to push away. It was the site of destruction, yes, but also modern life, superficiality, foreign influences, moral ambiguity, the frantic pace of the new economy.
Things felt unstable, foreign.
Exactly. The city seemed spiritually empty. Whereas the village, in these films, was presented as this reservoir of authentic German or Austrian culture, anchored by, stoic mountain men, pure village maidens, the unchanging rhythms of nature. It gave viewers who'd been totally uprooted physically and ideologically a reassuring fixed point, a moral and geographical anchor.
And to make sure this worked for everyone, both West Germans and Austrians, who were all traumatized, they kept the national specifics quite vague. Focused on folklore, settings that felt familiar but not politically charged.
Absolutely essential. The trauma was shared, the need for a new role was shared. So the psychological medicine had to be kind of universally palatable within that German-speaking world. By avoiding strong national specifics, they could focus entirely on the psychological restoration.
Sidestepping all the really difficult stuff. Recent history, national guilt.
Exactly. They were selling escapism, yes, but it was escapism with a really profound purpose behind it.
Okay, let's dig into that purpose. This gets us to memory, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How did these films work as a coping strategy? Not actually confronting the past, but coping.
Well, in theoretical terms, you could see them as a specific use of memory, a kind of cultural performance designed to boost societal resilience. Instead of what psychologists might call working through the trauma, which is hard, often painful, facing the past, integrating it.
Right.
These films offered more of a cultural acting out.
Acting out the ideal, compulsively, instead of reliving the nightmare.
Precisely. Theorists point out that what becomes central in a group's memory are the experiences that matter most to the largest number of people. And in the 1950s, that collective concern, it wasn't guilt or political reckoning yet. It was basic stability, warmth, belonging.
Survival, really, psychological survival.
Yes. These films helped the population compulsively perform the stability that had been lost. It was like a cultural act of rebuilding that put immediate psychological survival first, way ahead of historical confrontation. That reckoning, the deeper processing of the trauma, well, as we'll see, that came much, much later.
So we've got this idealized Heimat, established as the first psychological Band-Aid, maybe. But then the 50s move into the 60s. Society changes fast. Migration keeps happening. The economy shifts. That idea of a fixed, perfect home, it had to bend, right? How did the Heimat narrative adapt?
Well, the genre actually proved surprisingly flexible. It had to be, really, given the huge demographic shifts. You had ongoing internal migration, but critically, you had the Heimatvertrieben, those millions of ethnic Germans expelled from former Eastern territories. Integrating them demanded a change in how home was defined in the stories.
So the film started featuring displaced characters.
Yes. The message started to evolve. Heimat wasn't just your birthright anymore. It was something you could potentially earn or build or successfully integrate into.
So like the ex-belly character in a film like Echo der Berge, they had to sort of prove themselves worthy of belonging.
Exactly. The narrative problem became, how does an outsider gain belonging? And often the answer in the films was through, romance or really hard work or showing superior moral character. Like that ex-belly who finds love and takes responsibility for the local forest, proving he's a good, functional part of this new community.
Which must have been important for managing anxieties about all these newcomers, promoting the idea that assimilation could work.
Absolutely crucial. So the concept of Heimat itself became more plural. It started being defined by successful integration, by contribution to the community.
And some films even took it further, suggesting you could find a new Heimat outside Europe entirely, like in America. Yeah. Which seems pretty remarkable given the recent war.
Yeah, films like the Trapp Family Trilogy, which later inspired The Sound of Music, they literally showed migration from the Austrian Alps to the New World. This actively reframed travel and movement. What had been a source of profound loss for refugees was now coded as freedom, choice, a fresh start.
Wow.
So Heimat was shifting from this exclusive, local, maybe even racially defined idea of belonging to something more like a homeland in flux. It was becoming more of an earned psychological state than just an inherited place.
But that idealized picture, even the adapted one, it couldn't hold up against the social changes and the growing friction of the late 60s, could it? The moment people started digging into the trauma that had been papered over, and the post-war generation started asking really uncomfortable questions, the narrative had to crack.
It did. And this is where it gets really interesting, as you said earlier, the rise of the anti-Heimat critique.
Yeah.
By the late 60s, early 70s, that sanitized, idyllic picture of the village, it came under massive attack from critical filmmakers. The new German cinema movement explicitly set out to tear down the genre's moral and aesthetic foundations. That perfect little provincial world, the refuge offered by the 50s films.
They turned the camera around and showed the ugliness inside.
Ruthlessly exposed it as a place of profound repression and social injustice. These anti-Heimat films, you think of Peter Fleischmann's yacht scene in Aus Niederbayern or maybe Fassbinder's Katzelmacher, they totally rejected the simple happy endings. They showed the village as this claustrophobic, suffocating space.
Defined by
Xenophobia, homophobia, crushing patriarchal structures. In Katzelmacher, for instance, the community's hostility towards a foreign guest worker. It implicitly links those present-day prejudices right back to the unaddressed fascist past. The idyllic setting itself was revealed as a mechanism that let these communities preserve their own narrow, exclusionary ways.
That's a painful realization for a society, isn't it? That simple psychological comfort isn't the same as actually dealing with history. That the old stories were fundamentally dishonest.
They were. And this leads us right to the core problem that challenges narrative itself. How do you even begin to represent massive collective trauma? Things like the Holocaust or the partition of India, when simple, comforting stories are revealed as false, and the sheer scale of the trauma seems to break language itself.
If the standard realist narrative, the straight story, doesn't work anymore, we hit a linguistic wall. Is that the idea?
That's the profound linguistic gap. The everyday language we use just isn't equipped to capture the magnitude, the specificity of mass trauma. Just trying to verbalize it risks distorting the truth. Because victims and those unaffected, they simply don't share the same frame of reference. The connection between the word and the lived catastrophe is just severed. So for authors trying to address this, like W.G. Sebald, the goal isn't to create some neat, coherent, whole narrative that resolves everything. Because reconciling those two worlds, the traumatized and the untouched, is seen as impossible.
So if direct representation fails, the strategy has to be something else, like mediated distance.
Exactly. Distance becomes a necessary strategy. Temporal distance, spatial distance, linguistic distance. It's almost an ethical requirement.
Sure.
Writers in exile, or those looking back at the past from an estranged position, like Sebald, they're often in this privileged, though frequently painful, position.
Insiders and outsiders at the same time.
Yes. Salman Rushdie called it the double perspective. And that distance allows for what Sebald termed a stereoscopic vision. It replaces the impossible goal of whole sight.
Stereoscopic vision, like looking through two different lenses at once, that feels very much like Sebald's style. The self-reflection, the photos, the fragmented accounts.
He deliberately uses those tools to emphasize that memory is fragmented. It's often involuntary. It's an unending mediated process, never fully captured. His whole technique-mixing documentary style with fictionalized elements, it stops the reader from falling into easy false empathy or emotional appropriation.
Respecting the scale of the past while admitting you can't fully grasp it.
Precisely. It acknowledges that any representation will always be incomplete. The narrative form itself becomes a way of showing the limits of language, rather than pretending language can contain the experience.
Right.
And this complex, distanced approach is essentially what had to replace that simple, comforting, intact world narrative of the earlier films.
Okay, so this shift towards complexity, towards fragmentation, it's a heavy load. And I think it helps explain why, when we look at our media habits now, we often seem drawn to the simple structure of dystopian stories. Despite being bleak, they offer a really clear, structured crisis, don't they? We saw that huge boom in young adult dystopian fiction starting in the late 2000s.
Dystopian narratives really act like psychological barometers for society at any given time. The huge success back then, remember, it followed the 2008 financial crisis. It directly mirrored collective fears. Fears about government control, unchecked corporations, resource scarcity, deep inequality.
The formula works because it takes these huge, overwhelming, real-world anxieties and kind of channels them, projects them onto a single, manageable battleground, often with a lone teenage hero.
Exactly. It brings a kind of clarity, even if the vision presents is horrifying. You know who the enemy is. It's the capital or the authoritarian regime or environmental collapse personified. It organizes that free-floating existential dread.
And this appetite for bleak futures, it only seems to have grown, hasn't it? Especially
Right.
with recent events like the COVID-19 pandemic. That brought worries about government overreach, healthcare, social divides right into everyone's homes.
Oh, absolutely. The pandemic created fertile ground, potentially, for a dystopian renaissance. But for the genre to really come back strongly, the sources we looked at suggest it needs to move past the old formulaic tropes.
The love triangles, the chosen one.
Yeah, those cliches that kind of led to its decline by the mid-2010s. The demand now seems to be for deeper innovation, for new writers willing to push boundaries, offer genuinely diverse perspectives, and engage with our current mess in really thoughtful, critical ways, not just repeating the old formulas.
But let's shift from fiction to the real-world equivalent of that impulse, the relentless crisis-driven news cycle. Why are we so powerfully drawn to negative news? Even when we know it makes us anxious, stressed, are we just wired for bad news?
We're definitely battling a deep-seated evolutionary mechanism here. It's called the negativity bias. It's this fundamental tendency of our brains to prioritize negative information, assign it greater weight, process it more thoroughly than positive stuff.
Evolutionarily, that makes sense, right? Pay attention to the threat.
Completely. Being alert to threats, a rustle in the bushes, a sudden storm, a hostile look, is crucial for survival. Bad news literally feels stronger, more urgent. Our brains process it more deeply and store it more readily in memory than good news.
So if you scroll past 100 headlines, the two about a potential disaster or big scandal are the ones your brain biologically flags as pay attention.
Precisely. And our modern media ecosystem is basically designed to hijack that biological imperative. Social media algorithms, the way headlines are written, clickbait, urgency, the 200-to-7 cycle.
Yeah.
It's all optimized to trigger that negativity bias. It keeps us hooked by feeding us the very stuff our ancient brain thinks is most vital for staying alive.
Which explains why the usual advice, just limit your exposure or telling news outlets to balance things, often doesn't really work in practice. But if bad news taps into survival instincts, isn't telling people to regulate it risky? Couldn't it make us complacent about real threats? Is regulating just a form of, privileged ignorance?
That is the absolute critical tension, and it's why the conversation really needs to shift away from just avoidance. If people severely limit their exposure, you risk widespread public unawareness of really critical issues, climate change, corruption, or things that genuinely do need public attention and action.
So it's a dilemma. How do you stay informed without getting psychologically crushed?
Exactly. And this is where we need to move beyond the simple binary of avoid it or drown in it. We need to focus on how we engage with the information. This idea of mindful harmonious consumption, or MHC, it really seems like the necessary adaptive strategy for us now in the 21st century.
Okay.
It's the crucial strategy researchers are proposing for navigating this landscape. And the key finding is interesting. Just using media frequently doesn't automatically mean problematic use or psychological distress. What matters more, often much more, is how you engage with negative news, rather than just how much. We need to empower the user, you, to manage the flow, not just be passively hit by it.
Okay, so what does that mindful, harmonious consumption actually look like? Practically. Day to day, scrolling a feed, turning on the news.
It really boils down to two core things. First, mindful awareness. Before, during, and after you consume negative reports, you need to maintain conscious awareness. What are my intentions? What emotions am I feeling? What thoughts are running through my head? You have to ask yourself, why am I clicking on this story? Am I looking for useful knowledge, or am I just feeding a sense of dread?
That's the self-check-in piece. The why matters a lot.
Hugely. Then the second piece is harmonious regulation. Based on that awareness, you regulate your engagement. You align it with how psychologically stable you feel right now. The research shows someone feeling emotionally resilient might consume negative news for hours, and their baseline well-being doesn't really dip.
Okay.
But if you start consuming when you're already feeling anxious, and you notice your well-being dropping quickly, harmonious regulation says, disengage. Right now. Step away.
So the key is it's customized, isn't it? That fixed time limit advice you often hear, only 30 minutes of news a day, it doesn't really work because our internal state varies so much, person to person, day to day. This approach sounds like it shifts things. From passively consuming dread to actively managing information, it helps mitigate that feeling of being vulnerable and overwhelmed.
Absolutely. It transforms the experience.
Yeah.
From being battered by external forces to consciously managing internally. MHC empowers you, the user, to take that knowledge, which you often need to get from bad news, and turn it into something understood, something you can apply without succumbing to paralyzing information overload.
Okay, so if the simple comfort of the Heimatfilm isn't honest enough anymore, and the simple dread of modern dystopia or just endless bad news is paralyzing, what does a truly adaptive narrative look like? One that allows for hope, maybe shared hope, but without being naive. Where do we see that in, say, the literary world?
Well, it looks complex. It requires acknowledging shared vulnerability, embracing multiple perspectives, and this is where we could look at the concept of multi-directional memory. It's a strategy that tries to find the connections, the shared elements between traumas that seem completely disconnected. It moves away from that awful competition of victimhood idea.
Where groups argue about whose trauma is worse or more unique.
Exactly. Instead, multi-directional memory looks for solidarity. So, for instance, comparing the Holocaust with post-colonial traumas like the partition of India.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, these events are vastly different in scale, context, history.
Radically different.
But they might share certain fundamental structures of suffering. Displacement, the loss of language, political violence, the shattering of social identity. Multidirectional memory opens up this critical space for finding solidarity in those shared structures. And crucially, it reinforces the idea that distance, being outside the immediate context, can actually be productive for understanding.
At double perspective again.
Yes, writers operating from a spatial, temporal, or cultural distance can sometimes connect historical moments that seem isolated. They can offer new, challenging angles that disrupt those single, dominant master narratives.
And this need to embrace complexity, fragmentation, it brings us right back to how authors choose to tell stories, doesn't it? Like Salman Rushdie using magical realism and multiple voices to deal with the chaos of partition.
Magical realism is almost perfectly suited for this task, for addressing how inadequate ordinary language is when faced with massive trauma and how many subjective truths exist simultaneously. It's inherently eccentric anti-totalizing. Rushdie uses strategies like having multiple, often unreliable narrators, deliberately confusing the neat historical timeline, because history itself, after trauma, isn't a single verifiable document anymore.
I find his use of gossip really fascinating here, treating it not as trivial, but as a powerful counter-narrative. It's so different from a meticulous documentary approach.
It's a brilliant artistic move and deeply subversive. It challenges the whole hierarchy of what counts as truth. Gossip, in Rushdie's hands, becomes this undervalued form of everyday talk, and he uses it explicitly to undermine the grand official narratives imposed by the state.
Because gossip is messy.
It's scraps, shreds, fragments, as he puts it. It perfectly mirrors the polyvocality, the chaos, the confusion that's inherent in memory after a huge splintering event like partition. It validates the competing truths of ordinary people, the local voices that usually get drowned out by the official monolithic history.
It recognizes that the emotional truth of a community might live in those informal, fragmented stories, not the polished government report.
Exactly. And this chaos, this seeming disorder in the narrative, it's a conscious rejection of the idea that any single neat account could ever be enough. Furthermore, metaphor becomes absolutely critical in magical realism. It acts almost like a literal bridge between the magical and the realistic. It allows the subjective experience of trauma to manifest physically within the story's world.
The narrator even says something like, reality can have metaphorical content. That does not make it less real. That's a pretty huge statement about truth, isn't it?
It is, because it highlights that truth is multiple and often subjective. And the key point, for example, when a character in Rushdie remembers Gandhi dying on the wrong date, that narrative error is intentional. It's presented as that character's truth because, for them, within their lived, remembered reality, it has been sanctified by time.
So the art validates the personal lived experience over the official record.
It validates the polyvocality, the many voices, over the singular, often oppressive truth pushed by the state. And this is complex, layered approach. This is how narratives can reintroduce hope. Not through simple comfort, but through acknowledging and embracing our shared, multifaceted, often messy reality. #outress.
So when we circle all the way back to that paradox we started with, why the post-war audiences wanted joy and why modern audiences seem to crave collapse, the answer really lies in the different psychological burdens of each era, doesn't it?
It seems so.
Post-WWII audiences, their burden was instability, loss of identity. They needed to see a cohesive home rebuilt, even if it was idealized. They needed a narrative of simple restoration. Whereas we, today, struggle with this unprecedented complexity, the sheer volume of information, this kind of decentralized anxiety about
everything, everywhere, all at once.
Yeah.
And the weight of knowing everything that's wrong all the time, maybe it leads us towards the easy cynicism of dystopia, which ironically offers its own kind of simplified map of conflict.
Well, every narrative we've touched on, from that idyllic 1950s Heimatfilm to a hyper-cynical modern series, or the incredibly complex literary work of someone like Sebald or Rushdie, every single one is fundamentally an ethical project. It's a cultural performance constantly being reshaped based on the collective psychological needs of its time. The real challenge for us today, I think, is recognizing that just passively consuming dread is paralyzing. But active, mindful engagement, whether that's through the critical lens we see in anti-Heimat films, or the solidarity sought by multi-directional memory, or even just the practical day-to-day application of mindful, harmonious consumption with the news, that active engagement allows us to transform information overload.
From passive consumption, too.
To a dynamic process. It means striving for knowledge not just to create anxiety, but to become something understood, something applied. It's about using these narratives, these tools, to help us seek out complexity, yes, but also shared humanity, ensuring that awareness doesn't just paralyze us.